not having concentration of assets, the bigger banks now have more and more control over the financial assets of this country, and that is the wrong approach to take.
Dr. Carson, if I may, just on that point, despite measures taken, as the Governor says, since the crisis to make the financial system safer, the major banks in the US, many of them are actually bigger than ever. Assets held by JP Morgan Chase, for example, the very largest bank, have increased by nearly 40% to over $2.6 trillion. Do you think JP Morgan and the other big banks should be broken up?
Well, I think we should have policies that don't allow them to just enlarge themselves at the expense of smaller entities. And certainly some of the policies, some of the monetary and Fed policies that we're using makes it very easy for them. Makes it very easy for the big corporations, quite frankly, at these very low interest rates to buy back their stock and to drive the price of that up artificially. Those are the kinds of things that led to the problem in the first place. And I think this all really gets back to this whole regulation issue, which is creating a very abnormal situation. This country was declared its independence in 1776. In less than 100 years, it was the #1 economic power in the world. And the reason was because we had an atmosphere that encouraged entrepreneurial risk-taking and capital investment. Those are the fuels that drive it. And what we've done now is let the creep of regulation turn into a stampede of regulations, which is involved in every aspect of our lives. If we can get that out, it makes a big difference. And even for the average person, every single regulation costs money, and it's shifted to the individual. So, and it hurts the poor and the middle class much more than it does the rich. They go into the store and they buy a bar of soap. It costs 10 cents more. They notice it. And the middle class, when they come to the cash registers, they have a whole cart full of things that cost 5, 10, or 15 cents more. They notice it. It is hurting the poor. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton won't tell you that that's the thing that's really hurting the middle class and the poor. They'll say it's the rich. Take their money. But that won't help. You can take all of the rich's money and it won't make a dent in the problem that we're having. We have to come back to the fundamental principles that made America great.
But just to be clear, just to be clear, then you wouldn't favour breaking up the big banks. You think they're big enough, they're okay as they are as big?
I would have policies that wouldn't allow that to occur. I don't want to go in and tear anybody down. I mean, that doesn't help us. But what does help us is to stop tinkering around the edges and fix the actual problems that exist that are creating the problem in the first place.
Can I just add what he's saying? Because he's right on point there. You know why these banks are so big? The government made them big. The government made them big by adding thousands and thousands of pages of regulations. So the big banks, they have an army of lawyers, they have an army of compliance officers. They can deal with all these things. The small banks, like Governor Bush was saying, they can't deal with all these regulations. They can't deal with all, they cannot hire the fanciest law firm in Washington or the best lobbying firm to deal with all these regulations. And so the result is the big banks get bigger, the small banks struggle to lend or even exist, and the result is what you have today. And in Dodd-Frank, you have actually codified too big to fail. We have actually created a category of systemically important institutions, and these banks go around bragging about it. You know what they say to people with a wink and a nod? We are so big, we are so important that if we get in trouble, the government has to bail us out. This is an outrage. We need to repeal Dodd-Frank as soon as possible.
Let me also say, Jerry, let me also say that what Jeb is talking about with the big banks is to force them to reserve their capital of people who invest in, and they hold their capital so that if the bank goes down, the people who are invested in the bank are the ones that pay. That's what he's trying to say. Secondly, I'll tell you about Wall Street. There's too much greed. And the fact is, a free enterprise system is a system that's produced the greatest wealth for the world. But you know, Michael Novak, the great Catholic theologian, says that a free enterprise system that is not underlaid with values, and we should all think about the way we conduct our lives. Yes, free enterprise is great, profits are great, but there have to be some values that underlay it, and they need a good ethics lesson on Wall Street on a regular basis to keep them in check so we, the people, do not lose.
Thank you.
Gerard, can I comment
on that? You know, Jerry, your first question.
I do want to follow up.
Question,
Senator Cruz, and I will get to you, but Senator Cruz, on that theme, Facebook data shows that over the last month alone, nearly 1 million people, nearly 1 million, have been concerned about reining in Wall Street, apparently believing that some have not been punished enough. So as an accomplished litigator yourself and a former Solicitor General, would you go after the very people who believe and fear that Wall Street has ignored? In other words, the crooks that Bernie Sanders say have gotten away with a financial murder?
Absolutely, yes. You know, I've spent much of my adult life enforcing the law and defending the Constitution. And the problem that underlies all of this is the cronyism and corruption of Washington. You know, the opening question Jerry asked, would you bail out the big banks again? Nobody gave you an answer to that. I'll give you an answer. Absolutely not. And what we have right now is we have Washington, as government gets bigger and bigger. You know, the biggest lie in all of Washington and in all of politics is that Republicans are the party of the rich. The truth is the rich do great with big government. They get in bed with big government. The big banks get bigger and bigger and bigger under Dodd-Frank, and community banks are going out of business. And by the way, the consequence of that is small businesses can't get business loans. And it is that fundamental corruption that is why 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are in and around Washington, D.C. Now, let me give you a contrast to Washington cronyism. Some weeks ago, a woman named Sabina Loving testified at a hearing that I chaired in the Senate. Sabina Loving is an African-American single mom who started a tax preparation business on the south side of Chicago. She found a storefront. She wanted to have her own business. She started a business. But then the IRS promulgated new regulations targeting tax preparers. They did it under a more than 100-year-old statute called the Dead Horse Act. Now, this statute and the IRS, in classic Washington crony fashion, had exemptions for lawyers and big fancy accountants, but Sabina had to pay $1,000 an employee. It would have driven her out of business, and Ms. Loving sued the IRS. She took the Obama IRS to court, and she won, and they struck down the rule for picking the big guys over the little guys.
Senator, Senator, I really want to be clear here. Are you saying, sir, that if the Bank of America were on the brink, you would let it fail?
Yes. Now, let's be clear. There is a role for the Federal Reserve. What the Fed is doing now is it is a series of philosopher kings trying to guess what's happening with the economy. You look at the Fed, one of the reasons we had the financial crash is throughout the 2000s, we had loose money, we had an asset bubble, it drove up the price of real estate, drove up the price of commodities, and then in the third quarter of 2008, the Fed tightened the money and crashed those asset prices, which caused a cascading collapse. That's why I am supporting getting back to rules-based monetary system, not with a bunch of philosopher kings deciding, but tied ideally to gold.
Sir, I understand that. I just want to be clear, if you don't mind, that millions of depositors would be on the line with that decision. Well, and I just want to be clear. If it were to happen again, for whatever the reason, that you would let it go. You would let a Bank of America go.
So let me be clear. I would not bail them out, but instead of adjusting monetary policy according to whims and getting it wrong over and over again and causing booms and busts, what the Fed should be doing is, number one, keeping our money tied to a stable level of gold, and number two, serving as a lender of last resort. That's what central banks do. So if you have a run on a bank, the Fed can serve as a lender of last resort, but it's not a bailout. It is a loan at higher interest rates. That's how central banks have worked. And I'll point out, look, we had a gold standard under Bretton Woods. We had it for about 170 years of our nation's history and enjoyed booming economic growth and lower inflation than we have had with the Fed now. We need to get back to sound money, which helps in particular working men and women. What Washington does, the people who are doing well in the Obama economy, are those with power and influence in the Obama government. The people who are hurt are working men and women, and that's who we need to fight for.
Neil, that's the difference of being an executive. And let me just explain. When a bank is ready to go under and depositors are getting ready to lose their life savings, you just don't say we believe in philosophical concerns. You know what an executive has to decide? When there's a water crisis, how do we get water to the city? When there's a school shooting, how do you get there and help heal a community? When there are financial crises or a crisis with Ebola, you got to go there and try to fix it. Philosophy doesn't work when you run something. And I got to tell you, on-the-job training for President of the United States doesn't work. We've done it for 8 years, and almost 8 years now, it does not work. We need an executive who's been tried, has been tested, and judge the decisions that that executive